Early on, like D really gave me the opportunity to do a lot of cool stuff. Like I followed a heart transplant, and so like I wound up basically being on call until a heart was ready, and followed these guys beforehand and got to know them and stuff. But when that call came, like drove to Love Field, got in a Cessna with those surgeons, watched the harvest, watched them take all the organs out, got back with the heart, got a police escort back to the hospital, and watched them like sew it into a body and it start beating.
Welcome to the Hidden City Podcast. I'm Grant.
And I'm Doug, and we're here to share some of the incredible stories and people from Oak Cliff that you might not know.
We're going to sit down with some of the visionaries, craftsmen, and business owners who have shaped Oak Cliff into what it is today.
Oak Cliff is on the south bank of the Trinity River, a few miles south of downtown Dallas. While technically it was part of Dallas, it was its own city for a long time, and it still has that independent spirit.
We'll dive into the history and the spirit of this place, exploring the different challenges and successes that defined it.
This is The Hidden City, a podcast about the people and the stories that make Oak Cliff extraordinary.
Well, welcome to this episode of the Hidden City Podcast. We're excited to have Matt Goodman with us today, the executive editor of D Magazine. Matt, thanks for joining.
Man, thanks for having me.
Yeah. We're excited.
We're in a safe.
We're in a safe.
You tell me.
This is a very old building here, Tyler Station. We are in where the old safe used to be located, now a podcast studio. But we're also in Elmwood, which is where you live.
I do. Yeah, I walked here today.
Yeah,
so took a few minutes.
Not
I
too
walked here
far.
a lot.
Yeah, well, we've got a brewery. We've got a lot of good things here at the building.
I love Tyler Station.
Man, it's a good spot. It's funky. It's kind of like crazy with the bakeries and the breweries and the bike mechanics.
There's always something interesting to see. Yeah, that's true. Well, Matt, you're in Oak Cliff. You've been in Oak Cliff a while, but you're also part of D Magazine, which has just had its 50th year of existence this year, right?
50 years this year. Yeah, I think the first issue came out in October of 1974.
Wow.
Which is kind of nuts when you think like it's still within that family. So I think there was maybe like a 2 or 3 year period where Wick Allison sold it and then bought it back, but otherwise it's been locally owned, which is a pretty rare thing.
That's amazing
thing for this industry of ours.
We were looking at it earlier. It's family owned, in multiple generations. Or is it give us a little bit more of the history of D Magazine, because it's impressive that we have it here.
So Wick Allison and Jim Atkinson, who wound up going to Texas Monthly pretty early on. I think in the 80s actually, but they started it basically from the ground up, based it off of New York Magazine and Philadelphia and these other, Boston I think was another one, and just saw the need for cities to have a magazine that kind of like went a little bit further than the newspaper did. Also had restaurant reviews, which was kind of a novel concept in the mid 70s. But yeah, they essentially just kind of got the city's business class to back it, and Stanley Marcus actually sending out a note to everybody on whatever retail list he had saying you should subscribe to this magazine, like really kind of saved it in those early days.
Wow. That's wild. You got to spend some time with, is her name Linda?
Yeah, Linda Marcus. That was an amazing once in a lifetime opportunity. I had tea with Linda Marcus. That's for another time.
Did you get the pop over?
Yeah, we did get the pop over, but I guess if you get an endorsement from Stanley Marcus, that probably helps.
Yeah. I mean, they were like 24 or something. Just
no way. They just went for it.
Unbelievably young. Yeah. And this crazy idea, and then they like immediately started being critical of the power structure that actually supported them, which is, which I think is kind of a, people tend to kind of classify us in that realm, but Jim actually for the 30th anniversary wrote a piece looking back at those early issues, and he was like, it's really funny when people make that allegation, because we have immediately turned our attention to what that level of Dallasite was doing.
Yeah,
and to kind of help people understand power in the city.
That's interesting. Yeah, covering the power of the city and
not being afraid to talk about it either. From the get-go, it sounds like
they're stuck with us.
Yeah.
I mean, we've been here 50 years now. So.
Yeah,
that's pretty awesome. Yeah. It's good to have that sort of publication.
Yeah,
it's different for Dallas for sure.
For sure. So living in Oak Cliff, And I think at one point too, you were like, man, so many people from D Magazine also live or are around Oak Cliff. How does that influence kind of like the way you tell stories and what you're looking at and what you're covering?
Well, I mean, it's a cliche, and kind of dumb, but this idea of like Dallas being a city of neighborhoods, I think Oak Cliff is sort of emblematic of that in the sense that it still feels like its own place. It's always felt like its own place, even, obviously we weren't alive when it wasn't part of the city, but, it's always kind of stood out as a pocket of Dallas that does its own thing, and it's a huge pocket.
Yeah.
It's not just like one tiny neighborhood.
No.
Like, because I agree. I hear that statement a lot. Like, Dallas is a city of neighborhoods.
Yeah.
And Oak Cliff's a neighborhood, but man, Oak Cliff is like, it's a hidden city. Like,
Well,
it feels like it's
nicely done.
It's totally its own thing, but
Yeah.
it's bigger than it's like. Even explaining this to people too, where it's like, man, Oak Cliff has a bunch of neighborhoods in it, and so it's
There's like what, 20
size.
plus neighborhoods, or I don't know.
Yeah,
There could be
at
like
least.
undercount.
Yeah. There's like an
yeah.
enormous amount of
Yeah.
neighborhoods within this area.
Yeah.
Which is amazing.
Anyways, you're saying
No, I mean,
yeah.
it's just really funny when you come across people that think Oak Cliff is like Bishop Arts. And you're like,
yes, like a couple blocks.
keep
yeah.
going south.
Keep going a little further.
But yeah, so I mean, that's what always kind of drew me to Oak Cliff. Like I went to school at the University of North Texas, and one of my close friends grew up here.
Nice.
And so even just in college, I'm from Houston, and this is where we would go, if we weren't going to downtown or Deep Ellum for a show. So I was like super familiar with Oak Cliff and like driving down Sylvan and the road dips and the tree canopy comes in and it just like suddenly you're like, where am I? And then you're going
up
back
a hill.
and downtown's there. But East Dallas, it's kind of the same deal. Like the Deep Ellum, the thing that makes Dallas really cool is like you kind of get different flavors of what people are doing based on the neighborhoods you're in. And so I think that's probably influenced things the most. Like I'm just like really curious about how, Dallas is still a young city.
Yeah.
And the money hasn't completely corrupted some of the independent streak and entrepreneurialism.
Yeah.
For sure.
Fuck that word up.
Yeah,
But,
no, you're good.
Can I curse on this?
Oh,
Absolutely.
I think we can blame Sky McDaniel and Jimmy Contreras for our explicit ratings.
You let Jimmy in. But
we let Jimmy in.
But no, I mean it's really cool to have a place like that feels different from other neighborhoods in the city because you go to some other places and it's just kind of this like monoculture of just grayish. And there are pockets of that, but there's still a lot of cool stuff happening.
Yeah. Well, how did you get interested in journalism in the first place? I mean, you came to D Magazine, but what was that journey like for you?
Well, I hated math. I was never good at math, and writing kind of came naturally just in high school throughout my life. And I wound up like writing movie reviews when I was in high school because I realized that it would get me like press passes to movies at 16 and 17. And so I was like writing movie reviews for some defunct website that's not there anymore. But
that's a good hack right there, though.
Oh, dude.
I realized that kind of early, like the publicist, like you just get your name on some list, and all of a sudden, my mom was like going to premieres for years after I left. Because
that is
just
amazing.
in Houston, she's like, "Hey, we got the new Batman movie.
You want to come
pass?
see it?
Like me and your dad are gonna go."
Yeah, I definitely pulled that card. I did photography at A&M and worked for the newspaper there, and so I got to go on the field for every game.
Yeah.
And,
dude, you've done some amazing trades too for photography.
Oh, for sure. Yeah.
You got a chicken coop one time. You got
it's
You
crazy.
still have the chicken coop?
Oh yeah, we got chickens. It's in the backyard. Oh, it's awesome. Yeah.
It was like
coop's great.
$5,000 chicken coop.
It's amazing. No, but I like working that too. You're like, I think years later, like I was like, I'm gonna shoot an iPhone review on the A&M game, and they're like, done.
Cool.
Here's the side path. And I was like, great.
It's brilliant.
Yeah.
Yeah, but it just was something that came natural to me. I love movies.
Yeah.
And so that's kind of
awesome.
what I went into college with. I remember like going to orientation and just kind of going, they would, herd you into whatever major you might be thinking about. And I went into journalism, and I remember asking whoever was organizing the thing, I was like, is this where we need to be if we want to write movie reviews? And she's like, yeah, okay.
All right, college kid.
High schooler.
Yeah.
But yeah, so that's kind of, naturally kind of stumbled into it that way, and then started writing for the school paper. And once I started covering like news stories, it was kind of over. It was like, oh, this is what I want to do. So
That's awesome.
I got really lucky that was the first thing that I fell into. But yeah, I mean, that's kind of how it started, just that writing part.
Man, that's awesome. Yeah, I feel like going into that writing part, but then like now covering stories so as the executive editor, did I butcher that?
Yeah, I'm like executive editor for digital. So most of what I do.
What does that role look like?
website.
I guess is like, so are you kind of like working with writers? Are you actually doing a lot of the writing? Are you kind of sourcing some of these leads? Like, what does this look like?
Yeah, it's both. It's all of the above.
All of it.
I mean, one of the things I realized that Wick did was the titles that he gave all the editorial staffers are editor. And traditionally you think of editor as, the assigning editor, the person who's actually editing the stories, and they're writers. I think we've had like one staff writer, and I've been there for 10 years. Michael J. Mooney. But so we all do a lot of everything. And so my day can be a mix of, watching City Hall, writing about that, going to interview someone, editing a writer, pitching a story. It's just sort of a menu of things, which is fun. And
That sounds so fun, honestly.
Overwhelming. Overwhelming, but
It
it's
can
like
be.
Yeah.
I could see the challenge with when you turn it off, because you're probably always working on a story and or have an idea. And that's true of other jobs, but I think especially in journalism, it's like there's always something happening.
I mean, that's the cool thing about working at the magazine. Like, everybody there really gives a shit about this place and is very curious about it and really wants to kind of share these discoveries and
Like,
find
you're feeding
stuff.
off of each other. Like, I remember, again, it was college newspaper, but it was like, oh, everyone's into uncovering stories or telling a story, and it's there's a collaboration aspect to it that's like, I don't know, just special.
A little competition too with the writing, but I mean, all of that kind of comes together to create something much larger out of the whole, if that makes sense. Like, it's pretty neat. And then, I started my career in Killeen, Texas, which is adjacent to Fort Hood, as a business reporter. And then after doing that for a year, came back here and went to CBS 11 as an online producer. So I was like editing a lot of really terrible TV copy into newspaper stories, but what I realized was the editing side really helped the writing and reporting side, because it's you're thinking with a different part of your brain to be able to kind of go, this sucks. And being able to kind of figure out that self-editing process has been super helpful.
That makes sense.
I think everybody there would say the same thing.
So as you think
but
about,
it's a cost-saving measure, I'm pretty sure. So.
Oh yeah.
No, I could see how being on both sides of that actually would be extremely helpful as you now do what you do. But as you think about your stories over the years, you've written, do you have an idea of how many pieces you've written?
No,
okay.
No,
it's
I mean,
probably
it's really funny, like, when you think about just online stories, which I can, some things are 400 to 600 words, and sometimes you're writing 2,000 and talking to like 15 people. So it really just kind of varies. And so I have no idea how many things I've written over the years. But
they vary in size and scope, I'm sure. Do you have a few that over the years have been like favorite ones that you wrote and were well received, or even ones that you were like, man, I really thought this was going to go well, and like it wasn't as well received?
Well, I mean, I think the thing that I've had to kind of remind myself is to really be present during the process, because once it's out there, you can't control how many people buy the issue, how many people subscribe, how many people click the link. And that's just like a really fast way to bum yourself out forever. Early on, like, Dee really gave me the opportunity to do a lot of cool stuff. Like, I followed a heart transplant, which was pretty nuts.
Dude.
So Baylor at the time had a guy, great name, Gonzo Gonzalez. But he basically like flipped Baylor's heart transplant program around.
Wow.
And so, like, I think in the world, you could say there was Cedars-Sinai and there was Baylor. And it was like, how the hell did Baylor do this?
Dang.
And so I floated the idea. I was like, because I was covering healthcare at the time, it was like, can I follow this process? They're like, well, what do you want to do? And it's like, well, all of it, if you'll let me. And so like I wound up basically being on call until a heart was ready, and followed these guys beforehand and got to know them and stuff. But when that call came, like drove to Love Field, got in a Cessna with those surgeons, flew over to, I can say where now, but Tyler, watched the harvest, watched them take all the organs out, got back with the heart, got a police escort back to the hospital, and watched them like sew it into a body and it start beating. And so that's kind of like,
oh my goodness, man,
it's kind of like pinch yourself. Yeah.
Well, it's gotta change you as a person too to see that.
Well, the craziest thing about that was like it's just a job to those doctors, and so
they're
these guys, like the lung physicians in Houston, are just hanging out shooting the shit.
They're just like smoking a cigar, hanging out.
Well, might as well.
I know.
They're just like watching Monday Night Football until it's their time to go like cut into this person.
Wow.
But like seeing those kind of like when you're not involved in it, it's like this is super serious, and it is, but you see it and you're like, oh, this is just a day at the office.
This is their job.
But to an extent, it's also, I feel like it's one of the coolest things about journalism is like you get to see so many different, not all of it's awesome all the time, but it's like you get to see so much of the city and the things that are happening, and kind of be this person telling this story. And so it gives you these opportunities to just be like, never would I have thought I was going to be flying a Cessna to Tyler.
It's like, what's that over there? I'm going to go ask questions about it.
Yeah.
Today's show is brought to you by Oak Cliff Brewing Co. Are you interested in unwinding and connecting with neighbors over a great beer? Then go visit Oak Cliff Brewing Co. They've got a great tap room with all sorts of great beers on tap. It's a full production brewery here in the heart of Oak Cliff. Visit oakcliffbrewing.com to find out what's on tap right now and where you can find fresh beer made right here in Oak Cliff.
But yeah, that is one of the really cool things that, not everybody gets a chance to do.
Well, man, I think we've been building up to this a little bit, but I'd say probably one of the biggest stories that you've ever kind of like written about, broken, interviewed, is this article on Dr. Death, which has become incredibly famous. Everything from having its own podcast series to an adaptation, I think, was it HBO? I don't know.
It's on Peacock.
Peacock. Yeah, NBC Peacock. With Alec Baldwin, right? Like all this is crazy.
Yeah.
But so it's originated from work that you did to an extent, like in interviewing. Can you tell us like what did that process look like? How did you pull that thread? Like what did that look like to you?
Well, there was a lot of stuff written about him before I came into the picture, and so that was when I was covering healthcare, and I was kind of like following it from afar. Texas Observer had like this really killer story about Texas tort reform laws, which are created to kind of protect physicians who are doing really risky surgeries because, if you have a brain tumor, you want that doctor to feel comfortable that he can operate without, getting sued.
Why do that if it's so risky?
And the flip side of that is the tort reform laws that Texas passed capped what you could actually sue the physician and the hospital system for. And then you had to prove that the hospital system, in giving that physician credentials to operate, was like intending to harm patients. So it's essentially set up to where if you're a patient whose doctor sucks and hurts you, you're kind of fixed into these parameters of what you can actually get. And in a case like Chris Dunch's, who was the neurosurgeon we're talking about, he's paralyzing people. This is $500,000 isn't going to get you very far for the rest of your life. And so the Texas Observer used Dunch to kind of go through that process and kind of the downside of that. And, the morning news has written about it. A lot had been done.
Yeah.
And fast forward to the district attorney's office getting involved, and he actually gets charged for aggravated assault. And that's the first time I couldn't, I was talking to a bunch of different lawyers. It's like, have you ever heard of a surgeon getting like criminally indicted or charged with aggravated assault related to the surgical outcomes? And everybody's like, no. So, I mean, this is kind of a crazy case. And he was attempting to get his bond lowered. And so during the hearing, the prosecutors like brought out these crazy emails where he said a bunch of wild shit, and then also like, I'm ready to become a stone cold motherfucking killer.
Jeez.
And so the judge is like, no, you're staying. Bond is set. And my editor Tim Rogers saw that, and he was like, what's going on here?
Nice.
So I didn't want to, you always got to be careful, like, not to re-traumatize the people you're writing about. Like, you don't just want the salaciousness of the story. But I went back and read essentially everything that had been written about him, and it was as if he just like came to Dallas and magically started doing drugs and maiming people. That's kind of what, like, when you looked at the body of work, that was sort of what the takeaway was. So I was like, where did this guy come from? So I told Tim, if you let me go to Memphis, where he went to college and medical school and grew up, and like try to run down people who know him and kind of piece together like, how the hell does this guy make it, into these surgical suites?
This is like investigative at this point. Yeah, you're like, I'm going to another city, going to Memphis, going to go try to figure this out.
Exactly, because again, like, I think it's really valuable to be able to put those pieces together, because those are critical to really understand
who this person is.
Well, who this person is and why this situation happened. And so they said yes, and then Tim's like, by the way, I've already got the headline. It's Dr. Death. And I was just like, it's stupid.
I remember that cover coming out. Yeah, keep going.
It was not stupid. Tim is very, very good at figuring out like really punchy headlines for things that people want to read. And the moniker is stuck, obviously.
Yeah.
So we were the first to go to Memphis and the first to call him Dr. Death and kind of piece that together.
So, okay, you're in Memphis. You're kind of discovering some of this. You come back. Is it still just talking to lawyers? Is it like, what does that uncovering of that story still look like? Or is it?
Well, so much of it was in Memphis, right? So it was essentially like looking at any time this guy had been sued, had he gotten divorced before? He had, like, what public records are there available that could give me names of people who might be able to tell me some stuff about this guy when he was there? And so, you just kind of live on LexisNexis trying to find addresses after you find a name in a court filing or, deposition or whatever. And so the attorneys were super helpful, talked to the prosecutors a lot. And then it was just like, rent a car and go driving and hope to find people who will open their door and tell me stuff.
Seems like quite a rabbit hole to go down.
It was unbelievably stressful because it's just like...
Was it? Yeah.
I mean, I snuck in to the University of Tennessee Health Science Center to try and get a yearbook and just get some names down from his class. It was
that kind of stuff.
It's like you're doing undercover work, basically. I'm not.
Well,
I mean, it's
a little
like,
bit.
Yeah,
It was.
It's not just like, hey, I want to set up a time to talk to this person. It's like you're actually having to go and do things that, not the normal reporter might do.
Well, I was very lucky that I worked for a place that was like, we're going to spend the money to send you out there.
We trust you.
Well, and like, even understanding the risk that I could come back, $1,500 in the hole and no story. But for them to say, go for it. This type of work is really expensive to do, which I think is why it's really important to support your local journalism outfits, be that the Morning News, D Magazine, KERA, etc. Because, if the budget doesn't allow, that story doesn't happen.
You don't figure this.
But
was that something too that D Magazine had already been doing some of? Like, was this kind of a new venture for the rest of the staff? Like, for you to go and just...
No, we have a long history of doing kind of these deeply reported,
pieces,
big investments of time and money, these pieces that require such things. I don't know if you remember the district attorney Susan Hawk from years ago when she sort of disappeared from the office. We had a writer who rode down to rehab in Houston with her, to where she was getting treatment. None of that had come out, and kind of understanding like the impact of having an absent DA, even though she's clearly needing medical help.
Yeah.
But Dee is always kind of, if the story requires it and it's in the public interest and it's a good story, they've really,
it's part of the DNA a little bit with D Magazine. I do feel like your involvement in Dr. Death's story, was it a team effort? Was it really spearheaded by you? Was it how did that, what did that look like for you, and how long of that process was it?
The reporting was pretty much me. The editing was absolutely a team effort, and talking through structure, how to tell that story, sourcing advice. It was a big team effort in terms of just sort of guiding the piece. But that was actually in addition to my, I guess, day job at the time, which was kind of daily healthcare coverage. And so I was balancing both those things. And it took about a year. And that's not the only thing I was doing at the time.
I know.
It's a long time to be working on a project like that. I mean, I imagine it sounds exhausting.
A year-long project.
And you're so deeply invested in it.
Yeah.
Well, and also the story gets slotted based on, what else we have in the mix. And so, if I've got an extra 3 months to twiddle my thumbs or, call a million other people, I'm going to take it.
Yeah.
So at a certain point, the deadline's the deadline. And luckily I had enough time to kind of do that, to actually dig into it.
So once you finally finished the reporting, the writing of the story, you guys released it. It was the cover of that magazine. What was it like, I guess, for you to see it now out, and then obviously now we know it was such a national thing. It became such a. How do you look back on it now, knowing that it's gone to the podcast and the TV series and all that stuff?
I wish I would have done more after it was published. I mean, that was so. I mean, the podcast. I'll never begrudge Wondery for doing that, but they didn't involve us at all.
Yeah.
We got credited with the name, and that was it.
Really?
And that's
it. Yeah.
And all you need to do, the thing that kind of pissed me off was all you need to do is just kind of say this thing existed.
Yeah.
And a lot of it was they named this person and then moved along, and so there was some frustration with that.
Yeah.
But that podcast really moved it forward even more.
I'm sure.
There was my story was long. It was 7,000 words. And she did, 10 episodes of, pulling that apart. I followed the trial, obviously. But, I wish we would have been on top of it to go, hey, this would make a good podcast. This would make, we're a small shop, and we just weren't thinking like that. It was kind of it's finally done. It's out there. It's getting received really well.
See what the response is, kind of thing.
It was cool to go to the lead prosecutor's office, and she's like, hey, look at this. And she's got the cover framed. There's just neat little things like that. But I think it was sort of a wake-up call for the way journalism is going, that when you have the rare story that actually warrants a serial podcast or whatever that might be outside of just the initial story itself, you should go for it. That was sort of a wake-up call. But.
And kind of that's really interesting, because I could see how it's do you make a podcast out of this story or that story? That's a question now you're starting to, maybe people are starting to ask.
Certainly hindsight, you're
hindsight,
it's easier to probably make that assessment. You're dang. Yeah. But at the same time, I see what you're saying, which is when you think you've got something good.
Well, there's people who do it, obviously, what's the one? Serial podcast. That was This American Life, right?
Sure.
And then she kind of went off and did this, and it's how do you make those decisions? It's another medium of that storytelling or journalism, potentially. That
what year was that, too? Is it?
That was 2016. Yeah.
Okay, so podcasting obviously has come a long way since 2016. So I don't know what it was like at that point, but
it's just interesting.
It's just interesting to think back to that. But
it's kind of you got to stop thinking about your outfit as having a primary medium, right? Mm-hmm. It's we can do all this stuff now, and the companies that are doing it really well are investing in it.
Yeah.
Texas Monthly, for instance, they have a whole studio dedicated to this, and they've done a lot of really cool podcasts / magazine stories. And you're seeing that, New York Times, obviously, these kind of much larger shops. But back then, that was sort of like a novel
almost
concept.
like, novel, and also maybe like, that's someone else's kind of thing. That's almost like a different thing.
So Dr. Death, I feel like Wondery had just done Dirty John with the LA Times, and that was super successful and also became, I think, a TV show. I think it was just a TV show.
Mm-hmm.
And so Dr. Death was kind of their next big investment. And that was a company that was set up to do these kind of serialized narrative podcasts. And so it was usually that company partnering with a news outlet.
Interesting.
And then over the years, the way it's shifted are these news outlets are going, let's just create our own podcasting studio in-house. So that's been kind of an interesting
It's interesting moving, like what you were saying earlier, like D Magazine. So like the newspaper, like Dallas Morning News, like can do an article on something, and it's like it only goes so deep. Whereas the magazine, it's like, okay, you can go potentially a lot deeper. And then there's maybe even this part too where it's like, oh, now I can do like a multiple like media podcast series on.
And you can actually hear the people.
Exactly.
Like you can,
I
think it just kind of breaks that wall down even further.
Yeah.
And really, when done well, it can be like super compelling.
Yeah.
The other side of it is like some of the podcasts that clearly don't need to be podcasts. That you're just kind of like, really lost momentum. Three episodes.
This was a mistake. You probably didn't need this whole production.
Yeah.
Well, it is. I like that thread of not thinking about a primary medium, but like you've got all these available mediums as an organization, a publication of any kind. And I imagine with being involved online, you've seen like the print and the online movement as that continues to evolve, and then now we're into podcasts and all these other things. It's got to be a never-ending target to kind of try and hit. It's like
and you need human beings to do it. And sometimes you need pretty sizable upfront investments and bets that we can sell against this stuff. And so that's kind of the risk of the industry right now, especially for like smaller shops. It's like, do we move Matt off City Hall so he can spend 6 months on this podcast? Is that worth the risk of what
there's a strategy to this, and it's like, oh, there's an investment to this, and
exactly. And those are the questions that I think everybody's asking.
Throw Chat GPT in there, and you're like, what's happening? Like, I don't know.
Until it gets better.
Until it gets better.
I've chosen not to worry too much about it.
No, I know. Well, I feel like there's two things. It's like you can use it as a tool, or you get scared about it, and like, I think
we've talked a lot about ChatGPT and AI and how it's you're always going to have a person who has to be very good at something, and
ChatGPT is not going to be like, oh, this Dr. Death thread, I'm going to go pull this thing
putting
down.
the robot to work.
Exactly.
Just I don't know, but
it might help.
Maybe
you
we'll
go
be
through
proven
some
wrong in 5 years.
legal filings. Though.
Exactly. Just figuring out how to use that. I mean, that's kind of where we're going with it too. It's like, how do we use this in a way that helps our workflow?
Right.
And not, because it became really apparent after that initial freak out, but this is not ready for prime time. People see right through it.
Yeah.
But we'll see. I mean, it's coming some way.
Yeah. How does D Magazine use it as like a tool versus?
I think. Well, I mean, we've seen it too. It's kind of catching that fastball and realizing that like it is a tool at the end of the day. If you can use it to do your stories better, then great.
Yeah.
Like, that's a great thing to have.
And be transparent with the readers about how you're using it. And I think that's kind of the big thing, is just like not trying to hide it. Being like, hey, this is our policy. This is how we're using it. This is how we're looking at it. Even that's kind of how we've walked up to it.
What's D Magazine, how many people are on staff? I'm so curious.
So we've got we have about, it's probably just under 100 now.
Wow.
But it's we have D Magazine proper. We have DCO, which is a business title, which is where I started. We have D Home, D Weddings, and then we have D-Custom, which is a custom publishing division that creates magazines and other, content for clients.
Cool.
So Texas Farm Bureau is one of those.
Wow.
And so, we've diversified quite a bit just in-house, which is really awesome and really smart of us to do.
Yeah.
We also have like events and marketing teams, sales, obviously. So, when you kind of look at it, it's not like D proper has 90 people. We have, I think, 6 total, really, who kind of put this out.
Wow.
That's
incredible.
Yeah.
And, we frequently use freelancers.
Yeah.
There's a big ecosystem of that. And so, like, there are months where somebody's reporting a feature and then we're managing, freelance edits for the feature well and stuff like that. So it's, trying our best with
Yeah.
6 people, man. That is a small team. But it's got to be kind of fun to know that those 6 people are super bought in. It's you've got like a tight-knit crew.
Yeah. But we care a lot. And it's kind of a cool environment too, because obviously there's stories that you'll want to do, but also there's stuff like if I find something that might be better for someone else, it's like, hey, I think you should write this because I'd really like to read you on this.
Oh, cool.
And so it's kind of, that's I think a really healthy environment to be in, and really cool for the readers that everybody's kind of invested in. Actually, this would be really good for this person, which I don't know if every place is like that.
Right. Yeah, that feels very collaborative, not super competitive, which is what you want.
It's like even just like it's honoring of someone else's skill sets and stuff too.
Yeah.
You're like, man, this person would be awesome on this. Like like you said a second ago, I was like, that's a pretty awesome
good team to have.
Yeah, that's a great team.
Sometimes you're just like, I don't know shit about this topic, but it's very interesting.
Yeah.
Well, you get to go. You said City Hall is something that you'll go sit in on those meetings. I imagine you have your finger on the pulse of a lot of things going on in the city, and probably have a really interesting perspective on just what direction the city's going, maybe even what direction Oak Cliff is going. Are there some areas that like really pique your interest when you think about the city as a whole?
I mean, one of the things that I've really enjoyed doing is taking topics that I think seem or sound boring just on their face and try to make them really exciting and interesting. And usually you do that by like finding the people who are making those things happen, or just by way of, hey, this is how this topic affects where you live. And so a lot of what I've been following lately has been like land use and housing, which I think are, like I said, kind of boring sounding things, but really, really important to the future of the city, especially when we talk about, Dallas being a city of neighborhoods. Well, the reason that works is because people can afford to live in them. They can afford to open businesses. They can, without that, you start to push those people away, and things wind up being a little bit more, just like I said, like monocultured. In a way that kind of takes the fun out of living in the city. And so I don't think Dallas is there yet, but the housing question is one that I think we're going to be wrestling with for some time, and that goes into permitting. It goes into parking requirements. It goes into just the cost of housing and where density is appropriate, and the mechanisms that we can pull to actually change that to keep prices low enough so that people can afford to live here. I think Dallas is sort of at that tipping point, or approaching it, where you've got a lot of really established neighborhoods where zoning is so strict that there's not much you can do in them. So, and you've got really organized opposition to anything other than what's already there. So the challenge for the city is like figuring out how to navigate within those boundaries to try and find ways to encourage more dense housing in the right places and make it easier for people to do business. I mean, I think about the coffee shop in downtown Elmwood that like couldn't open. Said he couldn't open for over a year just because he's missing a couple parking spots because of a really outdated code.
That was crazy.
That was like, and then you can do the rational thing and point to a street that never has any cars on it.
Right.
It's still like the city's like, well,
Yeah,
sorry.
This is what it is. Yeah.
You know, and you talk to some of the lower scale developers who like can't fill a storefront in Lower Greenville without these if it's not like these specific businesses because of the rules the city has. And so like, what can we do to open that up a bit and make it easier for people to live and do business here?
Well, it's seems like I know this is at least a narrative, but like everyone and their mom is moving to Texas, like, and so it's like what that Texas Triangle kind of thing, and then Dallas is, and I would say Dallas, and probably it's more of its surroundings more so than the city itself, is feeling a ton of that, and so. I think you're right. It's like, man, how are we gonna handle this? I mean,
we're just like not equipped right now to handle that at all.
Yeah.
It is interesting. We had actually a talk here a week or two ago. I guess it was last
Wednesday.
Was it last week? Because we were both there. It was Charles
depending on when this comes out.
Chuck
that's right. At some point recently.
But
Chuck Marone, is that how you say it? Of
with
Strong Towns.
Yeah.
Who gave a fascinating talk about just the national crisis, basically, with housing and the gap there is for that starter home or for smaller houses that people can begin to live in.
Start to build.
How basically you're incentivized to build anything but that currently. So it is a big problem. Dallas it's not totally unique. It doesn't seem in like dealing with it, but still doesn't have a good answer yet, I don't think.
Well, the interesting thing about that talk too was the incremental development, the incremental growth at the, you know, you were basically mentioning that the financing structure, the way our country is built right now, there's just no appetite for those products, and so figuring out ways to create that is going to be really key for cities like Dallas moving forward. And I mean that kind of goes back to why Oak Cliff is so cool. It's like it is incremental, like it is small, it is, you know, pockets of it are obviously different than that, but there's still a lot of stuff that you can just kind of do. Like Tyler Station's a perfect example with what Monty Anderson has done, what you guys have helped do, where it's like, do you really need all that space for your bakery? Like, well, let's scale down so you know, you don't have to pay the rents for a place triple the size and what you need, and build into that. Like I think those ideas are super exciting because it creates the ability for me to go to Oak Cliff Bakery, Oak Cliff Bread on a Saturday morning. I wouldn't have otherwise, you know. I mean, it's those little stories that I think kind of make a city.
Totally agree with that.
Yeah, man. I mean, what's the alternative? You just keep going out further and further. I guess that's the Dallas kind of way, or what we see in North Texas at least, because there's so many people coming in, and it's like, okay, like you can either do that or just keep going out. Like,
well, Dallas proper is basically flat population wise. I think since 2018. So all that growth is happening in Collin, Denton, even Tarrant now. Because Fort Worth, I think, makes it a bit easier to do business over there, and it's still not as built out as Dallas is. And so if I'm an elected official, I'm looking at that going like,
you're losing.
Well, this sucks. Our tax base, you know, isn't growing at the rate we need it to in order to actually pay for our liabilities like our roads and sewer and all those things that just makes the city run. And so that's the stuff that it's like, how do I make that interesting for people to go, okay, this is why this really matters.
Well, it's so weird. Maybe, I don't know. Everyone, like, sometimes people be like, oh yeah, I'm from Dallas, and it's like, oh, you're actually like, you're 55 minutes north of like Dallas. What you need is Dallas, and it's like, and I get it, but it's like, it's such a big space, and like you feel like
I mean, I used to get shit. I grew up in Houston. I used to get shit from my college friends because people would be like,
were you outside the loop?
No.
Oh, okay.
No.
Okay.
And so it, you know, UNT, and people would be like, I'm from Houston, and then I'd be like, oh, what part? I'd be like, the Woodlands.
There you go. There you go.
It's like, Matt's going to ask you a second. He's going to ask you a follow-up.
That's funny.
And there's nothing wrong with the Woodlands or the suburbs, but I mean, I think cities should be an option for people who want to start a family here or just
make it their home.
Fucking live here. You know?
Yeah. Make it their home. Put the roots deep. I love it.
Today's show is brought to you by Waxspace. Are you looking for a place in Oak Cliff to connect and meet other neighbors? Then Waxspace is the place for you. Come join the Neighborhood Work Club, and for just $80 a month, you can get all the things you need to be productive at work. Why work from home when you can work from a place with other neighbors? We've got cold brew, fresh coffee all day, phone booths for your meetings. We've got a podcast studio and a lot of other amenities here. So visit thewaxspace.com to learn more and sign up today. Well, you've lived in Oak Cliff how many years?
So we moved here in July of 21.
Nice.
My wife and I, after living in Oak Lawn. But before that, we lived in Oak Cliff, and then I lived in Oak Cliff before we moved in together. So most of my time has been, I lived in the Cedars for a few years, which is another really cool neighborhood.
Yeah, it's a great
and then Oak Cliff and Oak Lawn, and then back to Oak Cliff.
So you've seen it change over the years alongside the city. Yeah. I mean, from your perspective, having I think a slightly different perspective than most people. How do you think about Oak Cliff and its future and where we're at right now?
I just miss trade winds, man.
Train winds. Yeah.
No, I mean, I think Oak Cliff is in a really good position. I think Bishop Arts, for all the hell it gets, probably needs to be the place where the apartments are and things like that. The issue is, how do you accommodate that growth without kicking people out? And that's where I think the city didn't anticipate. They rezoned it, I think, in 2010 to allow that stuff, and they didn't go any further or didn't go far enough to anticipate those unintended consequences of the families who've been there for so many years that now can't afford it or lived in just a duplex that was bought up, like that block was bought up.
Yeah.
What was that, 8th?
Yeah, that's the one Monty was talking about, right?
Yeah.
Where it just was the entire...
Yeah, I mean, the family...
Turned into a massive corridor of apartments.
The issue is, you've got landlords who are aging and probably don't want to manage that portfolio anymore.
Yeah.
And so, they're going to cash out. And so what's the city doing to go, oh, this is about to turn over into something that these folks can't afford anymore? Yeah. And so I think that's where Bishop Arts kind of went sideways. But, looking at Elmwood, looking at the West Oak Cliff area plan, and kind of looking at these kind of old streetcar adjacent nodes that have these really old, shopping centers that have just been sitting vacant for zoning reasons, for whatever, I think is a really cool opportunity to be able to turn those into things. Then even further south, like what Fort Oak Cliff is doing. Yeah. And, I just wrote about the Trust for Public Land, what they're doing with 5 Mile Creek, which is building 17 miles of trails that goes from Westmoreland all the way into the forest to connect to the loop.
Wow.
That stuff is really cool and very difficult to get done. And Dallas is doing it right now. Yeah. Oak Cliff is doing it right now. And so seeing those little stories, I think, is really encouraging.
That's cool. That's awesome. Well, Matt, we're so thankful you've been on the show, and thanks for coming in and having a beer with us and getting to talk through all this stuff. I think, we've enjoyed it and love the work you're doing.
Thanks, man.
Yeah, keep it up, man. Yeah, great to talk to you for a bit.
You guys did a great job with this safe.
Thanks,
come back and see us in the safe sometime.
Appreciate it.
Later.
Hey, thanks for tuning in to this episode of The Hidden City. We hope you discovered something about Oak Cliff that you didn't know. If you enjoyed the show, I hope you subscribe to it on YouTube and then follow us on any of the podcasting platforms. Also, if you enjoyed it, please share with a friend, and thanks so much for tuning in.